Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Good morning, everybody. This is a great group. I can't tell you how many times I say good morning and everyone looks down and I say good morning and then they have to say good morning. So you have avoided that. I do want to say at the outset, you may hear in my voice, I'm a little hoarse. I'm recovering from a head cold. And after last night, I'm very aware of the sniffle effect. So I'm going to do my best to keep my sniffling to a minimum so that you can concentrate on the content of what I say. I'm delighted to be here to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, securities law whistleblowing. As was mentioned in the introduction, I was the first chief of the Office of the Whistleblower, and I guess the thing I'm happiest about, given the tenor of some of the speeches so far and some of the vibe in the room, is that I can say that I no longer work at the SEC. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of support for the SEC here in the room. It seems like you guys are really hitting him with the hind. But I'm delighted now to talk about what I think is an extraordinary success story at the SEC, which is the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower. And I say that not at all humbly, because I did run the program for the first 5.5 years, was hired as the first chief back in February of 2011. And we'll talk about why I think it's been an extraordinary success in a minute. When I was asked by Mr. Nader to come speak at this conference, Breaking Through Power, it really occurred to me that it's a perfect title for the topic, because whistleblowers, in my mind, particularly securities law whistleblowers, can have and are making extraordinary contributions towards breaking through power. And how are they doing that? They're standing up and they're saying, wait a minute, my company's not acting in the appropriate way. They're having the courage to come forward and report it. And thanks to their efforts, which I'll talk about in a minute, there's been extraordinary frauds stopped, prevented. Companies exist today that would not have existed but for the fact that whistleblowers came forward. So whistleblowers are, and I think will continue to play a very extraordinary role in breaking through power and making sure that companies are held accountable. And why is this important? If you think about, in a sports analogy, I'm a big sports fan, the steroids in baseball. And why was it important that we ferreted those out? Well, we had players who were playing by the rules and playing clean, and ultimately it appeared that they were being disadvantaged to those who were not playing clean. More home runs meant more money, and this created a ripple effect so that everybody felt like, also in the Tour de France, in the cycling, everybody felt like if I'm not cheating, I'm not winning, and if I'm not winning, then why am I participating? And this, I think, is an apt analogy for what's going on, or what could go on, in the securities law field. If it becomes believed, if there is an appearance that a company feels like the only way I can succeed, the only way I can compete against my competitors is I have to lower myself to their level, and I have to cheat, and I have to steal, I have to manufacture earnings, pretend that I have earnings, ask my accountants to come up with new numbers, creative ways to make market expectations, then the whole system will ultimately crumble. And I'm certainly speaking to the choir on this topic. I think there's a lot of understandable skepticism about the credibility of our markets today. And part of that is because there's some suspicions that companies aren't playing by the rules. And I think SEC whistleblowers are going to be looked back upon as heroes in this crusade to level the playing field and to save our markets. People will stop investing in the American system if it gets to the point where people believe that the system is rigged, that it's only for the rich and the famous, and that you can't trust any given company with your money. And if that happens, the whole system collapses. I believe in the system. I believe that the American stock market is the best and most fair, transparent market out there. But I don't believe that everyone is playing by the rules. And I think it's important that the SEC, thanks to Congress, set up a whistleblower program that encourages whistleblowers to come forward. So let's talk a little bit about how did we get here? How did it get to the point where the SEC, Congress decided that the SEC needed to have a whistleblower program? And I want to take you back to the Enron and WorldCom days. Companies that very famously actually had whistleblowers, people inside who were very aware that their companies were not playing by the rules. And they were rightly celebrated, Times Persons of the Year back in the early 2000s, because they ultimately came forward and blew the whistle. Unfortunately, they didn't come forward soon enough, or at least their activities did not generate the kind of change that I'm hoping that whistleblowers today are able to do, come forward quicker, so that a fraud that starts as a small fraud maybe becomes a big fraud, but doesn't become bet the company fraud. And back in those days, you know, Congress felt like something had to happen, right? So they passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and under that paradigm, essentially what Congress did was, I think, listening to corporate America saying, okay, we'll give you the tools, corporate America. You can be trusted because you tell us you can, to ferret out wrongdoing and take care of it on your own. So created systems. Yes, Congress required the SEC to pass rules that required companies to set up internal compliance programs, among other things, to have their outside auditors audit the internal compliance function, and basically put tools in place, force companies to put tools in place that if an employee saw something, they had the means to say something, and then the theory was if companies are aware of it, if you tell us that there's something wrong, we can take care of it. We, corporate America, can take care of it. And so now, and there was a lot of hand-wringing about how that was going to work and how much money it was going to cost and how disastrous it was going to be to competitive advantages because U.S. companies now had to put in robust internal compliance functions and robust anonymous reporting systems. But ultimately, everybody adapted and the world went on. But the problem wasn't solved, was it? So 2002, Sarbanes-Oxley's passed, and now fast forward, we have the worst financial crisis in history, 2007, 2008, 2009. And so Congress decided, okay, corporate America, we gave you your shot. We made you put in these tools and invest in these tools to have your employees feel empowered to come forward. And it didn't work, so we've got to do something else. And I'm delighted to say that Congress decided, among many other things in the Dodd-Frank Act, to pass Section 922, which is the section that required the SEC to set up a whistleblower program, and there's a very great section there that required them to hire someone to run it, and that led to my job. So I was very, very happy that Congress did that. And if people think government doesn't create jobs, I'm here to tell you it created at least one, and I was very pleased to have it. But so the idea is, okay, we need new tools, you know, breaking through power. How do we break through the headwinds against people coming forward? Why is it that people who are aware of the fraud at Enron and WorldCom didn't come forward? How do we incentivize them? What kind of tools can we give them to make sure, take the policing of corporate wrongdoing out of the hands of the wrongdoers and put it in the hands of the good, hardworking people, many of whom want to keep their jobs, most of whom are only interested in being loyal to their company, and want, when they think that things aren't right, they want to say something. They want to report it. And so Congress created the SEC Whistleblower Program that is composed of three fundamental aspects, all of which I think are extraordinarily important. And as I said, not too humbly, I think the SEC has implemented it very, very well, and this is an extraordinary success story. So the three aspects of the program are confidentiality, anti-retaliation protections, and money. And money is the one that gets the most interest, and I'll talk about that in a second. But let's just briefly go over the others. Confidentiality was an extraordinarily important part of the program, and Congress specifically instructed the SEC that you may not, SEC staff may not disclose anything that might directly or indirectly identify a whistleblower unless and until they're required to, for example, if the whistleblower needs to testify in the case. Implementing this part of the program was the single biggest challenge, but the most important challenge that the SEC office undertook in my early days, and educating the enforcement staff that the very first time that there is either a reality or the appearance that a whistleblower comes to the SEC at their own peril because the SEC will be cavalier about having their identity revealed, the program would collapse on its own weight. You know, it's a program that counts on people who see something, feeling empowered to say something. And if a person feels like, when I go to the SEC will be cavalier, and then I'll get fired, then nobody would come forward. And so we spent a lot of time educating enforcement staff on the importance of maintaining confidentiality of whistleblowers, and that extended through the process where we paid people. We saved the SEC, I still say we every once in a while, you'll forgive me for that. The SEC keeps confidentiality even up through the time where they pay whistleblowers life-changing money. You'll see that in their press releases they say very little about who got paid and in connection with what case, and I think it's extraordinarily important. Anti-retaliation is the second leg of the stool, and again, the program will not exist, could not succeed the way it has if an employee felt like if I see something, I can be fired and the company can be, will not be held accountable for doing so. So for the first time in the SEC's history since 1933, when the SEC was created, for the first time in 2011, Congress gave the SEC the authority to enforce anti-retaliation protections for whistleblowers. And that means that companies now know that if they do something bad to an employee who in good faith comes forward with a potential securities law violation report, they can't take negative action against them because the SEC has the authority to punish them if they do so. And I'm proud to say that on my watch, the SEC brought its first anti-retaliation case in 2014 against a hedge fund in New York whose main broker reported to the SEC that he was being asked to do some shady dealings, self-dealings. And immediately, the chronology was immediate. From the time he notified the company that he had notified the SEC, everything went bad for this person in his job. He was stripped of his duties, stripped of his access to computers, was locked in a room with a stack of trades this big with a yellow highlighter, and told, okay, compliance guy, if you're that concerned, go through 10,000 of trades and highlight the ones that you think are problematic. He said, if you give me access to my computer, I can do it in 30 seconds. They said, no, you got time. Just stay in that office. You got your highlighter. And so he left the company. And I'm very proud to say that not only did the SEC bring an action for the underlying violation that the whistleblower brought, but we also brought charges, or the SEC also brought charges against the company for their retaliatory conduct, and the company paid a significant fine for doing so. I'm not here to make news for the SEC. I don't work there anymore. But I can promise you that that is not the last retaliation case you'll see in the SEC space. Enforcement staff, once a first case is brought under a statute, everyone gets excited about it, enthusiastic about it, and I spent a lot of my time in my last, say, 6 to 8 months talking to enforcement staff around the country about why they should bring a retaliation case, how they should bring it, the resources that we have in place, or the SEC has in place to bring these kinds of cases, and there will be more. Similarly, in this space is what I call pretaliation, which is companies using documents to contract whistleblowers out of the program. So again, the people who passed the rules in this regard were smart enough to say, well, you can't run an SEC program that requires people to come forward if corporate America can then contract out their employees, either through an employment agreement or a severance agreement, and say basically, as a precondition to your employment or a precondition to you taking the severance, you agree you'll never tell the SEC anything that you learned about while you were here. And so Rule 21F17A is part of the SEC's whistleblower regime, and it says that no person shall take any action, including enforcing a confidentiality agreement, to preclude someone from reporting to the SEC. And the SEC has been extraordinarily successful in this space as well, and having brought now 4 cases under 21F17A, 2 in the last month, telling companies that if you say in word or substance you accept a severance or you accept some perk from the company, and in exchange we buy your silence, and you don't put a carve-out in there that says nothing in this agreement says that you can't report a possible securities law violation to the SEC, you're going to be held accountable for it. And the SEC has brought, like I said, 4 cases so far. And again, I'm not here to make press for them, but those are not the last cases we'll see in that space either. And then the last aspect of the program, the one that brings the most attention, I think, is payments. Dodd-Frank says if you're a whistleblower and you help the SEC bring a good action where they get over $1 million in sanctions, you can collect anywhere from 10 to 30% of the amounts that are collected in that action. And I'm very proud to say that in 5.5 years, 34 people were paid over $100 million out of the SEC Whistleblower Program. I think an extraordinary rate and number of people being paid, an extraordinary amount of money being paid to reward people who made the hard decision to come forward and break through power and speak to their companies and say, I'm not comfortable with what you're doing and how you're doing it. And this $100 million that's been paid out was across about 30 cases, and they covered the full spectrum of kinds of violations, Ponzi schemes, offering frauds. Every possible kind of security law violation has been reported by these important, brave whistleblowers, and they've been rewarded for doing so. And one of the things that I'm most proud of is, $100 million is a lot of money to pay to people for doing the right thing. But it incentivized people to come forward who might not have otherwise. And since then, since the program was initiated, the SEC has received over 14,000 tips in less than 6 years. So it's working. It's sending a message. If you see something, you say something, the SEC will protect you, they'll maintain your confidentiality, and by the way, you can be paid. The underlying number that I'm most proud of in connection, I was very proud to pay $100 million out as quickly as we were able to. But the number I was most proud of is in connection with the cases, just the 20 plus cases brought to the SEC's attention by the whistleblowers who were paid. Just those cases have resulted in over $500 million in penalties and sanctions against companies. Think about that. $500 million in less than 5 years, thanks to 20 plus people who came forward under the SEC program. Included in that $500,000 is over $350 million that has been collected in disgorgement. And what is disgorgement? That's money that the SEC orders companies to pay back to people who were victimized by a fraud. So over $364 million has gone back into victims' pockets thanks to the efforts of 20 plus whistleblowers under the Whistleblower Program. So the program is off to a very, very strong start. I think it's been extraordinarily successful. I'm very honored, having now left the SEC, to have joined a law firm, Phillips Cohen, that represents whistleblowers and encourages them to come forward. And if you see something, say something. And at the end of the day, when people ask me, how do you get somebody to come forward? Are you anti-America, anti-corporate by representing whistleblowers? And I think it's quite to the contrary. I think it's important that whistleblowers know that if you work for a company, your company could be Enron, your company could be WorldCom. And so if you see something, say something, because the job you save may be your own. And the pension that you save may be your grandmother's or your grandfather's. I had a good friend who worked for MCI, and then it was bought out by WorldCom, and all employees were forced to put all of their 401k money in company stock. And when that company went under, he lost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he was just one person. And that's the kind of thing that needs to change, and that's the kind of thing that whistleblowers can help change, breaking through power by coming forward. And I'm very proud to say that the SEC has set up a very extraordinarily successful program in the early days, and I think 10 to 15, 20 years from now, we'll look back and say, that was a real game changer. The chair of the SEC has called it such. The head of the Division of Enforcement has called it as such. I took the job because I thought it could change the game. I think it's changing the game and will continue to do so in the future. I thank you very much for your time and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.